We have as our guest, we have a local pastor in the area who is a graduate of our school, Pastor Bobby Warrenberg from North Shore Community Baptist Church. Pastor Bobby's been a missionary, pastor overseas in England, worked in the business world, a graduate of our school, and for the last couple of years he's been at North Shore Community Baptist. And our theme has been the mistakes we've made in preaching and learning from them. So he'll be sharing a couple of those, and after he speaks, you're welcome to ask any questions you have for him. All right? Well, let's welcome him.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. All right, well, great to be here. Some of you might know that I grew up in Austin, Texas, and growing up there meant that I was part of one of those mega churches. So we had a church of about, 2,000 plus people. And that basically meant that even though I was a student leader and involved in leading small groups and that sort of thing, I was never going to see the pulpit no matter what. So when I graduated seminary in 2007 here, I think I had a total of 8 sermons to my name. We were missionaries for a little while in China, so occasionally you get invited back to a church and you preach, that people just kind of tolerate it for 20 minutes or so. And 2 of my 8, though, were from preaching 601 and 602. And one of those, actually, I don't know if they still do it like this, but there was a little makeshift sanctuary room with a little pulpit, and Haddon Robinson behind the camera. And so one of the sermons was actually Haddon Robinson with a kind of a growling voiceover as he's filming me and kind of giving advice. So it was really interesting when it came to candidating. So I was candidating for a church in London, and they say, well, could you please send us a copy of one of your sermons, an MP3 video or something? And I'm like, I've got nothing to my name. I've never really preached. All I have is this one from Haddon Robinson where he's like critiquing my sermon and, hey, that intro, Bobby, is really bad because, So I was like, not going to send him that. But that kind of actually builds into one of the things I just wanted to share with you, which is one of the lessons I've learned is that it's not within you to do this. It's actually really not within you to do this. It's not within you to preach like 40 times at least a year over a 40-year career, which is a whole lot of sermons. And one of the things I think I've learned is that all throughout the last 10 or so years, I've constantly been in this position where I'm in over my head. When you're starting out, everything's a first. So it's your first ever sermon, it's your first ever wedding, it's your first ever funeral, it's your first hospital visitation, first elders meeting. And so you're just basically, you spend a few years just being terrified constantly. And God just saying, let's just take the boat out to deeper water, and always in this never really finding your comfort zone and always in over your head. And I think the sooner you can recognize that it's not within you, and you're just going to have to trust that God is going to provide what you need, the sooner you can recognize that, the better. One of my early lessons of this, so as I said, I had no preaching experience at all. And I was a pastor in London, and in London, you do 2 sermons every Sunday. And they're different sermons. So I would kind of split these up with a senior pastor. So I went from no sermons to preaching every week, and I was just getting started in that, and they asked me to lead a youth holiday. So over a week, I was going to have to give like 8 messages, right? So that's doubling my total for the last, 30 years at the time. So anyway, we're sitting down, and it was about 5 minutes before the youth event was about to start. Music is striking up, and, you can hear all the youth coming in. And we're just meeting as a team of leaders, and the key leader said to me, I think I need you to give just an evangelistic sermon. I can tell that really what the youth need is just to hear about the gospel. And this friend, he's one of my best friends. His name's John. And he said, just give him the sermon. I thought, you're asking that like I've got an evangelistic sermon in my back pocket, like I've never done one of these. Like I have no idea how to do this. And he said, you'll be absolutely fine. And everyone else in the team is saying he's not going to be fine at all. I mean, do you realize he's never really preached before? And, you're just wanting to on the spot. Music is starting up. The meeting is starting. And John said, you can do this. And I said, I cannot do this. And even my wife is saying, yeah, he can't do it. he said, I know you can do it. And I said, fine, I'll give it my best shot. So they cleared the room, the meeting's starting, and I literally dropped to my knees. And I've dropped to my knees because I was raised Presbyterian. You know, we don't do radical things like that. So it's like my second time ever. And I drop on my knees, and I just say, God, I've got nothing. And I'm supposed to preach in about 5 minutes, so you're going to have to give me something. And just this thought came of talk about Peter and his denial of Christ and tie that into Psalm 51. And so I just went with that, and I preached like 40 minutes. And it was a great lesson of this isn't going to be within you. So be prepared for God just to call you into situations where you're terrified and unprepared and you don't have what it takes. And you just have to rely on him to deliver. So that's one lesson. So it's not within you. It's not about you. That's another big lesson. So one of the challenges of being a kind of young communicator preacher is there's going to be a big gap between your pretext and your subtext. So your pretext is you're preaching on justification by faith, and you're saying, God has given us this incredible verdict by grace. So the only eyes that ultimately matter in life are God's. The only verdict on our life that ultimately counts is what God thinks about us, and he's justified us by grace, and we're accepted to him, and that doesn't mean you have to prove yourself anymore. And you're going to be saying stuff like this, right? But inside, what you're thinking is, oh my gosh, I hope they like this. Oh, I hope they ask me to do this again. Hey, how's this coming across? Oh, I think I just fumbled on that. So there's a big gap between what you're saying and actually what you're resting in and what you're living out of and what you're experiencing. So there's a gap between your pretext and your subtext of what you're saying and what you're actually feeling. And I think part of the challenge in that is to learn to recognize that it's just not about you. And I don't say that to like make you feel bad. I'm actually saying that to try and liberate you. That thank God it's not about you. If it was about you, you'd just be terrified the whole time. But if it's actually about the people and them meeting Christ, and if it's actually about God and what he's doing, then that just frees you up for your heart to be full of others rather than your own self-awareness and insecurity, and I hope I do well at this. So one of my favorite examples of this is actually a parable. It's called Palm Monday. And Palm Monday is about the donkey that carried Jesus into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And so Palm Sunday took place, and now it's Monday, and the donkey wakes up, and he thinks, man, I can't wait to go into town. It's going to be amazing today, because yesterday was so big. And so the donkey walks into the marketplace, and he sees some vendors at a table, and he kind of strutting over to the table. And they look at him like, you dirty, rotten donkey, get out of here. No donkeys in the marketplace. And so he's like, whoa, okay. And he walks away, and then he sees some kind of religious people having a conversation. He kind of swaggers over to them, and they're like, get out of here, you smelly donkey, go have a bath. And he slinks off, and all throughout the day, he's getting rejected constantly, and he eventually, his ears are kind of starting to flop down. He's really sad. His head's hanging low, and he sort of struggles his way back home, and he runs into his mom. And she says, oh, what's wrong, sweetheart? You seem really down. And he said, well, yesterday I walked in the marketplace, and everyone was cheering. And they were throwing down palm branches, and they were lying down cloaks. And I was this amazing person yesterday, and now it's Monday, and nobody wants me around, and they don't recognize me, and they're. And the mom donkey kind of pats him on the head and says, silly, silly donkey, it wasn't you they were praising, it was him. It's not you they were praising, it was him. So it's not about you. You have the privilege of being the Lord's donkey, right? You get to carry Christ into the lives of people. And they're the one, he's the one they need. And so just, again, allowing that to just rest on you, that it's not about you, because it really wouldn't be good if it was about you. It's about him, and it's about carrying him into people's lives. So that was a second key lesson I learned. Third, what I have down here, don't be boring. Have you ever listened to a sermon that is exegetically faithful, and because you train here at Gordon-Conwell, you're going to learn how to be concise and clear in the way you outline your sermons. So it was exegetically faithful, it was incredibly clear, and just dead boring. A total yawner, right? No one's engaged, and you're like, but I gave them the text, but I had this great outline. One of the things that makes you boring in preaching is when you're giving people answers to questions they don't really care about. So that's kind of really what makes for a boring sermon. And the antidote to that is to spend time, especially early on, and I think throughout really, with lots of different kinds of people. Because inevitably, you will preach to the people you hang around. So if you can diversify who you spend time with, it'll be their questions and their struggles and their problems that you will read the Bible with those on your mind. And so when you preach, you'll be answering their questions. So if you want to preach in a way that gets non-Christians to come, or that engages young people, or engages retired people, or is diverse, then you've actually got to prioritize visitation and hanging out and just being with people. So somebody you guys have probably never heard of, Tim Keller. Has anybody heard of him? He put, this is a version of what he said. He said that contextualization is learning to give the Bible's answers to the questions people are asking in language they can understand, with arguments they can feel the weight of. And usually sermons are boring because they're not contextualized. They're not connecting with the deepest fears, hopes, dreams, aspirations on people's hearts. So if you don't want to be boring, you've got to know what those things are. You've got to know what their questions are. And the only way you're going to do that is by spending lots of time with people. So there's a tendency when you start to think, it's all about getting the text right. And it is certainly about getting the text right, but it's about more than that. And so don't spend all your time kind of diving just into commentaries or whatever. I would say you are leaving here with a theological education that nobody else on the planet really gets. So it's very unlikely that you're going to be wrong. And so spend some time in the commentary, but also prioritize time just being people. And I find that visitation is a great way of doing that, especially with older people. It just keeps you real. It keeps you, therefore, interesting. So right now you're going to leave and you're going to preach sermons that seminarians find interesting. But if you want to have anybody besides seminarians in your church, you should diversify your people. Fourth, vulnerability brings connection. A lot of times people, what they want of a pastor is the holy man, but that's not what they need. And if you're going to try and be the holy man to people, then you're never going to you can't allow anybody to get very close to you. Because as soon as they get close, they're going to see that you're not the holy man. I think some of this might be a generational thing. I think maybe previous generations would say, kind of keep your own self-disclosure to a minimum. Or if you share something, make sure it's something you've already triumphed over, a sin or a problem that you've already sorted out. But to be honest, I'd really discourage that. There's something about weakness that becomes the vehicle for the gospel. And so I would encourage you to use personal stories in your preaching, to share your own failures, your own faults. And don't just share the ones that were like 30 years ago that you figured out. Like share like this week. This last Sunday I talked about flipping off my computer screen on the airplane because I was so stressed out and frustrated. Now you might think, wow, pastor, but I tell you what, it draws people in. And why does it? Because you're being real, and you're basically saying we can all be real here. That's one of the gifts of the gospel, is a gift of reality and authenticity and confession and an ability to own your stuff. So I'd really encourage you to be vulnerable if you want to connect with people. Lastly, I just say, I think a sermon ultimately, it's not only it's not within you or about you, but it's really about Jesus. I feel like I really learned how to preach here. I learned how to do good exegesis here and how to organize a sermon. One of the things that started here and has definitely grown as I've been in the pastorate is to think about what's the goal of a sermon. What are you actually trying to achieve? And I would say that you're trying to help people to see Jesus. Ultimately, and this is St. Augustine, ultimately people will become the thing they most love, or they will throw their lives towards the thing that they most worship. So if you want people to change through your preaching, then you need to change their worship. So don't just, give 5 points of application for avoiding an argument, although that's probably really helpful. But actually seek for their affections to be changed. Seek for their heart to be kind of aimed at a different thing. And I would say that the Bible says that that's Jesus, He said, as I'm lifted up, I'll draw all men to myself. So I would encourage you to make Christ the goal of your sermons, to point people to Him, to lift Him up, and to learn to use Christ and His work on the hearts of people. So when the passage is raising an issue of the fallen condition or sin, learn how to take what Christ has achieved for us and apply that to whatever the fallen condition is in the passage. And others can really help you to do that. But I've found that when I preach Christ, that's when I'm relevant to the converted people in the church and to the unconverted people, and that's when people change. So those are my thoughts for whatever it's worth. Yeah.
Was the computer offended?
My wife thought I was crazy. My teenage daughter thought it was hilarious. So, yes.
How long have you been a pastor?
Just over 10 years now. Yeah.
And where are you pastoring?
So I'm at North Shore Community Baptist. So that's in Beverly Farms. So it's a historic Baptist church. Goes back to 1829. So we're having to figure out, our church is a little bit like Rip Van Winkle waking up from a 20-year nap and finding out the world has changed. And so we're trying to kind of figure out how do we take the same gospel and connect it with modern people. It's one of our big challenges.
How many members do you have?
To be honest, I don't know how many members I have. We probably have about 400 people that are meaningfully connected to the church, 400 or plus or something. Maybe close to 200 members. So we're actually trying to actively encourage membership. It's good to have a bit of a fringe in the church, but you just don't want people parking in the fringe for too long. So we're trying to kind of grow the membership. I think it's around 200 or so.
Were you called there during seminary?
No, so after seminary, I went to London and preached in Southwest London for 8 years. And that was great because I had to figure out how to take the gospel and connect it to post-Christian secular people and lots of different demographics and that kind of thing. So that was a really helpful training ground. Yeah. Caleb? So I've got a lingering cough that's like, I don't really need to cough, I just feel like I have to. It's like,
Hey, Bobby, thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Is there something that you do consistently to get feedback about sermons, or do you even listen to your own sermons? Is there a trusted 2 or 3 elders that you go to? Kind of what's your system for feedback? And do you make sure to avoid your wife with that, or is she engaged?
Yeah. So what was the last part you said? Is my wife serve that purpose?
Right. Does your wife get engaged with that process, or is
Okay,
there
gotcha.
a safety there?
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I would say early on I listened. So at first I didn't listen to my sermons because I was just too insecure to face them. And then maybe a few years in, I started listening to them. And I haven't really been listening to them so much recently, unless I'm really sleepy. No. I would say I try and listen to them if I think that maybe they went wrong, if they didn't land. So if you sometimes you sense that just people didn't seem with me, or they didn't really seem to land in the way I'd hope, and I'll go back and listen to it then. To be honest, usually it went better than I thought in my own head. So if you are prone to being discouraged, sometimes it can make you feel better. I guess it has the potential of making you feel worse, but So I have done that some, but not so much recently. I think I would, if you can get your heart to a place where you can invite critique, it really is helpful. One of the things that's a little bit hard is preaching, like a lot of things, it's something where you can give advice better if you're actually in the guild quite often. So in other words, you'll get some kind of feedback that tells you something about your sermon that you think, yeah, well, I'm never going to do that again anyway. So, like you misspelled something on your PowerPoint, or something like an illustration that wasn't clear or something. You think, well, in other words, you'll get some feedback that was helpful for one sermon. But the kind of feedback to really listen to is something when they see a pattern or they give some feedback that's really useful for things in general. So, for example, I remember, so at least when I was growing up, when you saw math problems, a lot of times the teachers would say, show your work, which is always hard for someone prone to look on others' papers. But I remember a friend of mine saying once that, hey, give us a little bit more of your exegesis because then we can kind of see where you're getting some of the stuff from. Show us your work a little bit more before launching into something else. So that would be feedback that could apply more broadly. And quite often that sort of feedback comes from people who understand preaching, really, right? The wife, usually she doesn't say anything. If she doesn't say anything, it was good. If she says something, it usually wasn't so good. And then there's the rare moments where she'll say, that was really good, and that was like you're one in a million. Yeah. Yeah, go on.
If you were to re-listen to one of your sermons from, 16, 17, 18 years ago, and maybe one from this past year, what are some of those patterns that you're talking about that have changed?
Yeah, I think one thing I've really learned is that people can tolerate minimal abstraction. That's a fairly abstract sentence itself. So in other words, you need to get down to earth really quick. So, don't wax eloquent too long on kind of the theological principles and this and that in the text, because you might find that really interesting. And people will find that insightful, but just really keep that to a minimum. So I find that more now, I'm more, probably a greater percentage of my sermon is on kind of helping people really understand it and from a modern standpoint and apply it. I'd say the percentage has swung more in that direction and maybe not quite as much of just unpacking all the intricacies of it. I think the other thing is that the younger you are and the earlier you are in preaching, the more your illustrations are kind of illustrations that you could have used in any church, in any place. And so they're kind of good. Maybe like you hear an illustration, you're like, oh, that's an amazing one. But the more you go on and the more you actually befriend the people you're preaching to and get to know the area, the more localized your illustrations will become that will be more pertinent to them. And so I'm hoping I'm kind of moving more in that direction. That's just a couple things that come to mind. So hopefully simpler, I'd say, becoming simpler and more concrete than abstract.
Bobby, I liked how you said that vulnerability is a good vehicle for the gospel message and freedom to own your stuff. And I wondered if you could, that's kind of newer to me. I'm wanting to go in that direction from less vulnerability. I wondered if you could, I still have a kind of a hang up about a previous pastor talking about this family being a kind of a safe area and wanting his kids, his family to feel like it was okay to say or do something and it wasn't going to come up in the pulpit on Sunday. So could you say any experiences with that, or do you run it past your family members if you're going to say something? How do you handle that?
That's a great question. A general principle, so I've not always been good at this. I think sometimes I tend to too much disclosure of others in the family. But just a couple things. I'm talking about self-disclosure. So it's not really cool to disclose other people's stuff, is it, right? But it's okay. I'd encourage you to kind of, for self-disclosure. So if you're going to share a story of vulnerability and kind of basically failure, well, let it be your own, not your wife's, for example. Bad idea on that. And bad idea, with the kids as well, because they'll learn to resent it. If I do share a story about the family, it's usually something they did really well that was praiseworthy. Or, if it's about one of the little ones, it's something relatively cute. But I don't, I share my own things, not the family's problems. Yeah.
So my question is, I've got a couple of different questions actually. So initially when you left seminary, you went to England.
Uh-huh.
And you preached there. You were kind of driven for missions. So my question is, what made you come back?
Great question. Yeah, so I'm an only child. My parents are getting older. So I needed eventually to move back to be closer to them. And also my wife was really ready to move back. Our kids were at a place where we either were going to be there permanently with their schooling, or we are at a transition time. It's kind of a now or never. I'm a pretty affective person, so I tend to live out of my heart. It's not a bad thing, but I'm kind of passion-driven. So one of the terrifying things about coming back was coming back to something I wasn't passionate about. And so one of the things I've always been passionate about is actually lost people. I even, to some degree, I feel more comfortable, well, not more, but I spend a lot of time with people that aren't Christians, and I feel really comfortable there. And so I've always had this desire to be where the gospel isn't really flourishing or advancing. And so when I was preparing to come back, I did a Google search of least reached places in the U.S. And there was a study done by J.D. Payne, and it broke it down by county. And Essex County, where we are, is in the top 50. So there's about 3% or less people that have a meaningful relationship with Christ. So in spite of Gordon College, in spite of Gordon-Conwell, by and large, churches are not reaching the lost on the North Shore. So I thought, wow, I've always loved this area. I love New England. I've gradually become more and more of a Yankee, or I guess I lived in Britain, so I became even worse than a Yankee. And so I knew that I could enjoy this place, but then when I saw that need, my heart really opened up. And then just randomly at a church fair, a friend of mine mentioned to Jeff Arthur that we were looking to move back, and he was at our church, so they were looking for a pastor.
Awesome. Okay, thanks for that. I had one more question. You mentioned that you want to keep your sermons interesting, not boring.
Yeah.
How do you measure that? I mean, you probably implement laughter and humor in your sermons, and I mean, how do you measure it not being boring? By congregation feedback, by other means?
Yeah, I'd say if you don't know how to answer if you don't know if your sermons are boring or not, you got a problem, right? Like a lot of times you'll just kind of know that was just boring. I mean, just people were just looking at me like a cow looks at a new gate, right? Just sort of like just a glazed over expression, or you're like, that's not a sermon that I'd even find engaging, right? So I think you'll kind of intuitively know, to be honest. But I think, again, the way you know is probably if you're preaching to these people in front of you, meaning your sermon is addressing their questions, burdens, hopes, fears, issues, interests, or if you're just preaching in generalities. But I think you kind of intuitively know. That'd be my sense. And if you are boring, there'll be a way for feedback to come, right? Such as, maybe we should get some more preachers to just share the load. Yeah, behind you, yeah.
So kind of going off of the idea of engaging, the idea of unction, which is kind of like an old-timey kind of a,
word. Yeah.
The old guys used to refer to unction.
Yeah.
How is it that you're aware, and you mentioned earlier, first thing, realize that you're not capable of doing this, that, who is sufficient for these things? No one is really sufficient for these things. Mm. How in your preparation and in your Bible study, in all you're doing to prepare for a sermon, how is it that you go through that process of realizing, okay, there's an unction, Holy Spirit process that's happening here in my preparation, and how does that then meet itself out in your sermon?
So great question. I would say part of that goes back to the first principle, which is it's not within you. So part of this is a work of the Spirit that you're just going to have to trust God for. Man, to this date, by God's grace, I've never walked into the pulpit to preach a sermon I wasn't passionate to preach. Praise God for that. I think I'd just rather die than have to do that. And there have been times when I actually wrote my sermon and I kind of read it through and I'm like, this is just terrible. I'm not in this. And I just scrapped the whole thing. So a lot of unction, I think, comes when the Spirit is applying the truth of your sermon to you. And so you want to be heard. So my family's been through some really hard events in the last 3 weeks, and I was preaching on Jesus' baptism. And I think that's Jesus' way of saying, I'm all in. I'm all in for this rescue thing. And that really, to know that God was all in for me in this hard time for our family, so that I could go all in for him, I mean, that was really speaking to me. So I preached with a lot of unction that week. And somebody gave me some feedback saying there seemed to be some righteous indignation. It really wasn't that. It was just I was really passionate because it's the sermon I needed to hear. So I think preaching a sermon that is preached to you, and that's almost cliche to say that, but somehow that transaction has to happen. This might be another Kellerism, but there's something about, when you're trying to get the baby to eat the baby food, and the stuff's nasty most of the time. It's coming out of this jar, whipped together, a bunch of random stuff. That the way you get the baby to eat is you taste and you're like, that's good, isn't it? Oh, that's so good, And then you give it to them. And I think people have a way of knowing if you've tasted this truth already. And so I think that's part of the unction. Yeah.
So I guess for preachers who are just beginning, there's a small tendency to try and preach like their favorite preachers, like a Tim Keller or a Francis Chan or whoever. What was like your process in determining your own voice and Yeah, really important. Yeah, I'd really highly recommend you not to preach and sound like someone else. It's great to learn from other preachers, and I'd say it was especially important for me early on. I just listened to a ton of sermons just to figure out what the heck I'm doing. But I think as you go on, maybe you don't need that quite as much. But as you do that, it's really important to find your own voice. So I think part of that happens as the truth is speaking to you, then it is coming out of your own voice, as opposed to putting in the microwave a truth that someone else has taught and kind of serving it up to people. So, and I'd say, again, I just really encourage you to learn how to use the gospel on your own heart, so you don't have to use other people's stuff. And yeah, I don't think any of us are as crass as to try and copy the mannerisms of someone else or try to sound with a voice like someone else. But probably it's finding your own voice is just, it's the truth of the text through your own personality, right? And so just really strive for that. The other thing, actually, one other thing that I think will help is something I think you still force people to do here, which is preach without notes. One of the things that happens with preaching with notes is that you get stuck in you're more worried about saying what you wrote down than just talking. Talk from your heart. Talk from your heart. And sometimes even that discipline of not speaking from your notes will really help with that. Those are a few ideas. Yeah, John?
All right, last question. Great. Go a little more to the pretext and subtext in the sense of, I imagine, so like in the times, I feel like probably the more you do it, the less, maybe quieter that.
Sure.
But has there anything that's been helpful in terms of just, obviously we're doing it for the reasons, of connecting people to Christ and having life change, but there is that tendency, if I'm honest, of, you want to make sure this goes well and those kind of things. So just anything that helped you battle that well, or maybe speak to that just a little bit more.
Yeah, great question. So though I'd love to say I attribute it all to the great sanctification process of God in my life, I think a lot of it is really just repetition. It's really weird to stand up in front of people and talk. I mean, nobody does this except us, really. And so that's going to just feel weird. And so one of the best things you can do for yourself is force yourself to do it all the time. And that's why that when I got asked to do that youth weekend or week, that was so great because I had to just stand up. I couldn't prepare like I wanted to for all these messages, but you're just up front, and it just becomes less strange. And so a lot of it is just familiarity, honestly. And then the other part of familiarity comes with, you've been there before. So now, when I do a funeral, I've been there. I've been there for some really horrible, hard funerals. And so experience just allows you to, you're less terrified because you've just been there. So a lot of it's that experience. I think the other thing is that a lot of us have kind of surface issues that we wrestle with, and then kind of some deeper issues in our life, and then we've got these deep idols in our heart. So for me, a deep idol has always been, I want to fit in, I want to be one of the cool people, I want to be in the inside cool group, whatever. That goes back to when I was 8 years old. And so some of these kind of deeper idols in our life just take time. And I think, but God really does work on those. I mean, marriage has helped me a lot. So I struggle with the fear of man. My wife does not struggle with the fear of man. She's just not terrified of anybody, just doesn't care what people think. I'd love to be like that. But she struggles with other things. So we rub off on each other. Good friends can rub off on you. So I think as the truth, as the gospel is just applied to you in a deeper way, that subtext is going to become something you're really resting in your justification by grace. And so when you're preaching it, you really do mean it, and you really are tasting that. But that just takes some time. And yeah.